Imagine a late night at a bar. A woman walks over to a man whose only company is the half empty glass in his hand. She puts her hand on his shoulder, leans in close, and whispers something in his ear. The two are then seen leaving together. But before the night is over, the woman will be dead, having been stabbed 40 times. Months later, in a trial, the man openly admits to killing the woman, but argues that this murder was justified as he was panicked and disgusted by the woman's come on. The jury acquits the man. Sounds ridiculous, right? Would never happen in a real court of law. Well, let's change the woman out for a gay man or trans woman, and you have what's known as the gay and trans panic defense, a legal strategy that seeks to reduce or even acquit the charges of an alleged murderer. Today, we'll be talking with Carsten Andresen, a criminal justice professor, to discuss the history of the panic defense, Jamie Grace Alexander, a trans activist, on how this defense is just one part of the bias that prevents the LGBTQ community from finding justice, and Julie Palakovich Carr, a delegate from the Maryland General Assembly, who has proposed a bill that would ban this defense in the state of Maryland. I'm Luke Fisher, and this is The Long Arc. Dr. Carsten Andresen, a criminal justice professor from St. Edward's University, has been maintaining a self-research database on the uses of panic defenses. Dr. Andresen explained exactly how the defense is used in the court of law.
It is actually four separate sort of theories of defense for people who are arrested and charged with committing murder. Three are basically theories that are excuse defenses, where they say, I committed this murder as a result of insanity or a temporary loss of sanity, or because I was not in my right mind. And underlying that is homophobia. The person says, somebody made a pass at me, somebody winked at me, I think somebody was gay and they were flirting at me, and I absolutely lost it and I killed them. And those are excuse defenses. It's still a crime that they committed, but they're making an excuse for it, and they're hoping for either a lesser charge or even maybe an acquittal. The last theory is self-defense, where somebody says another person of the same sex tried to sexually assault them. So a man says, I went over to somebody's house, that person tried to sexually assault me, and so I have a right to defend myself. No means no. So I killed them. And that's a justification defense. They're saying that what ordinarily would have been a crime was justified because they were protecting themselves from the serious, grievous injury of a sexual assault. Why we call it a gay panic defense is usually there is no evidence to support an attempted sexual assault. Often there's several cases where it's somebody who's 22 years old, 6'2", and they kill a man in his 70s who's 5'7" and in poor health. So I never want to sort of challenge a victim of a crime, but in this case, the facts don't add up, and it does not appear to be an attempted sexual assault. Trans panic comes in usually under the excuse defenses. And what the person will say is either I was about to have sex with somebody, or I was engaged in some sort of sexual contact, and I discovered, lo and behold, that the individual was trans, or afterwards I discovered the individual was trans, and it so shocked me and it provoked me that I temporarily lost it and killed the person. Trans panic, you will see sort of them borrowing excuse defenses where they say, I lost it, I was afraid, I was disgusted, I was outraged. And then they will also sort of bring in, and I call it almost the silence of the lambs defense, where they will try to sort of make that person appear monstrous. They will usually sort of emphasize the size, or that the person was a physical threat, and that they were trying to sort of sexually assault or hurt the person in addition to surprising the person. But usually if you look beneath the surface of these cases, people that are involved in somebody who is trans, and it's scary to sort of tell somebody, I am trans, if you look beneath the surface, they usually knew what was going on, who the person was they were with, And so those defenses, sometimes they are effective, but if you look at it, they don't really hold up in the light of day.
I asked Carsten to confirm that the gay and trans panic defense is not a codified law at the state or national level, but rather an attempt to take advantage of a potential bias against the LGBTQ community.
There is no law that says, oh, by the way, if somebody winks at you, even if somebody is lurid, somebody says to you like, hey, sweetheart, what's going on? Oh, I'm doing my work. Why don't you come over here and work on me? You're still not allowed to kill somebody. Because if that was true, if you're allowed to kill somebody who made a sexual pass at you, I mean, the population in the entire world would be 85%, 90% women, 10% men, because we would have all been killed by now. Not us specifically, but men catcalling, whistling, winking, all those men dead. So it is an affirmative defense, and it plays off bias and prejudice.
According to Carsten, the gay and trans panic defense has stretched back decades, but has evolved over the years to take advantage of the biases and prejudices of a court jury.
So in the 50s and 60s, in this book, Indecent Advances, I think the author's name is James Polson, and it's an excellent book. There was this whole series of essays about sexuality and same-sex sexuality that were totally wrong in the 50s and 60s, but here's what they believed. They believed there was a certain population of males, and I'm not sure if it was for females as well, but for males, that they could kind of go either way. They could be either heterosexual or homosexual. And they saw that in this essay, the series of essays, as being like having a proclivity to a disease or being vulnerable to a disease. And so what they thought is these people who are potentially like homosexual vulnerable, they're vulnerable to becoming gay, that if somebody hit on them, it was even worse in their eyes that somebody just hit on somebody that was 100% super heterosexual. So they hit on somebody that was potentially gay, then that person, it would be like going up to somebody who is at risk of COVID-19, if you had COVID-19, and breathing in their face. And so they thought like, these people are vulnerable to disease. The diseased person is coming over, trying to infect them. And so that was sort of a really strong image that they would use in court. And then today we have all of this stuff around masculinity. We have stuff around all these sort of ideas that gay men are predatory, that people who are trans are trying to trick you or trying to fool you. And when HIV and AIDS were more rampant, there would be this idea that somebody's trying to infect you and kill you with AIDS. And so these biases, they go through some changes, but the one baseline sort of bias is this idea of masculinity. And that if you're a man, and another man hits on you, then it's expected, it's normalized that you will respond with a violent response, that is somehow justified.
Through his research, Dr. Andresen has found that the panic defense is successful in reducing charges 38% of the time, and acquittals or even complete dismissal of the charges happen in 5% of the cases. But he warns that even when it's not successful, it's still harmful.
Even if it doesn't work at all. Let's pretend you try to use the gay panic defense and you get the death penalty. And that's happened in a few cases. I don't believe in the death penalty, but if you have the most extreme punishment and you have somebody commit a really extreme crime, perhaps you should be consistent in the application of the death penalty. But even if it is totally unsuccessful in every sense of the word, advancing this defense is bad because it sort of still puts out there without checking it, without addressing that it's bullshit. It allows that image out there, and so somebody's going to take something away from that news coverage. They'll say, "Oh, that person got the death penalty," but gay people, they're dangerous, they're predatory, and and that person got caught up in it. They didn't respond right, but be careful of gay people, because they're going to come after you.
That idea of gay or trans people as predatory is oftentimes the subtle crux of an attorney's defense.
The defense attorney, in almost every one of these cases, they flip the roles before the jury. The killer, the defendant, because they haven't been convicted yet, the defendant is the victim. The victim is the predator. So they flip it, and it is amazingly effective. There was a case here in Austin where the trial was in 2018. And I talked to a reporter who interviewed jurors. They basically gave the person a very low sentence. This individual chased a man around an apartment, chased him under a table, pulled him out, stabbed him 4 times. He only got a 6-month prison, a 6-month jail sentence. Then he's on probation, and he's on 10 years probation. But probation is kind of a cakewalk, especially if you just commit a murder. Probably you're not committing any other sorts of crimes. You commit a one-time murder. Probation can be a real cakewalk for you. In the jury, this journalist interviewed these jury members afterwards, and the jury members were telling the reporter, according to the reporter who talked to me, that they felt more sorry for the person who killed the individual than for the victim. And it is, I mean, in a murder trial, I mean, some of these defendants, they may have some compelling narrative. They may have some sympathetic side. You know, people who do something wrong, they're not 100% evil, but to sort of not always keep in front of you, that person brutally murdered somebody and took somebody's son off the planet, off the earth. You know, you never call that person again. You never have a moment with that person again. They don't get to go on with their life, and to sort of discount the end of somebody's life. It's amazing how effective defense attorneys can be at really focusing sympathy and focusing empathy on the defendant rather than the victim.
The lack of empathy for the victim is seen especially in murders of trans people.
Trans panic cases, first of all, that's a huge mystery. And those are the cases that are really depressing. In those cases, you do any degree of research on it, it messes with your psychological health. Because first of all, there are so many of these murders, and there are murders that are not identified, but the murders that are counted, there's a few people, a few activists, and a few organizations that track those murders. But I don't know the percentage, but I would say maybe 20 or 30% of them, they identify a suspect, but maybe 50 to 70%, they never find the suspect. These are unsolved, and they have no person of interest. They have no person that they're investigating. They're just unsolved. And when you read about these cases, people just seem generally sort of indifferent about it. Many of these cases, too, that I've seen with the gay panic defense, there are people who are African American, there are people that are white, there are people who are Asian, there are people that are Latinx, there are people that are Middle Eastern. There are all kinds of victims. And that's obviously the case with trans panic cases, too. But in these trans panic cases, there's also a lot of people of color who are trans. And it seems like those cases are not prioritized, that people are not focusing on those cases. And it's like this hidden murder statistic that's so tragic to see these people. And you read these accounts of these people, and they seem wonderful. And I mean, they seem like they had all of these strikes against them. They live in a bigoted society. They don't have a lot of money. And if you don't have a lot of money and you're trans, it's hard to get the sort of medical care that you need to get. It's hard to think about how you can get the surgeries that you need to be whole. But one thing that's striking is all of these people are trying to keep it together. People usually remember them as being friendly, as being concerned about people, as being like sort of the bright spot in their day. And then they're brutally killed. And if they even find somebody and they prosecute them and that person uses gay panic or trans panic, I'm sorry, those cases, the charges are low. And then I'll give you 2 cases. The charges are low or non-existent, and people are not very sympathetic. We had a case recently in Austin, 2017 or 2018, where the person was prosecuted, and the person only got, I believe, 20 years in prison. They'll do 10 years of those in prison for killing somebody who was trans. But that's a very short sentence. And then we had a case in right around the same time in San Antonio where somebody who was trans, I don't know if they catcalled or they sort of said something flirtatious to somebody. And that person, this is in San Antonio where we have these canals downtown, they pushed them into the water. That person couldn't swim. They drowned. And that person was charged. And the prosecutor, I think, really tried hard. They charged them with manslaughter. And the judge refused to hear the charge. And so that person got away with pushing somebody in the water, drowning them. And that's the end of the story. So that person's just will not have any justice. And when you read the description, I mean, these descriptions of these individuals, I don't know how they're so strong. And yeah, I don't want to get choked up. It gets in your head. I mean, I mean, I have this weird view. Like, I mean, I wish there was a heaven, and I wish there was a heaven that I don't want anybody to get killed, but give them something. Don't just brutally kill them after a hard life and give them nothing.
For Jamie Grace Alexander, an ACLU Maryland outreach director and trans activist, it's that lack of justice that has spurred her to educate and organize the people in her community.
To me, it's about justice. And I think that so often for me in my work, I see like there's an epidemic of violence in the Black trans community. And so infrequently do the women who are murdered at the forefront of my mind, but like assaulted or beat up otherwise, like so infrequently do Black transgender women or women who are the victims of violence get the justice they deserve. And I think the reason that they don't get the justice they deserve is because of defenses like the panic defense that victim blame them, and then that victim blaming makes its way into court proceedings. Moving forward, I don't want to see, if there's a Black transgender woman killed and we know who did it, I don't want to see them leave the courtroom smiling, and that's happened too many times.
That epidemic of violence presents a scary and potentially fatal balancing act for trans women when it comes to disclosure.
Disclosure is something that exists in trans community when you're passing. I don't have to out myself to the grocery store cashier because my trans identity is not relevant to that transaction. But exceedingly, as relations get more intimate, the stakes are raising higher and higher. And especially when you're dealing with sex work or even just finding someone to love, it's a big question of when do I tell this person that I'm trans, and how will they react? And will they react violently? And what would happen if they react violently? And I feel like this legislation says okay, if they do react violently, the law is not on my side. Often trans people are blamed in those situations of you should have told that person sooner. You should have told the cashier that you were trans. How did you expect him not to, beat you with a roll of quarters? The context of I didn't know that she was trans, I feel is an overwhelming part or contributor to that victim blaming that I was mentioning earlier, of if a trans woman doesn't disclose her T to someone, that automatically makes her a target of violence. And certainly heterosexual trans women are living a scary reality of this violence is a present fear.
In the wake of that present fear that Jamie mentioned, I asked her, how much pressure does society place on the trans community to disclose?
The pressure comes from internally. The pressure comes from not knowing how someone would react. And I would say that the societal pressure is really on passing. It's on appearing to be cisgender in order to walk through the world. Because when trans people do not appear cisgender and walk through the world, they receive more violence. So the pressure is to pass, but the internal pressure is, I feel like I'm holding a secret of who I am, but really I'm just doing what I need to do to keep myself safe. The amount of effort that especially trans girls have to go through in order to pass is exceptional, painful at times. And certainly the consequences are different for each person. Does affect people differently than others. And that's not right. To reduce harm in the trans community, disclosure should be left up to the trans person in every case and no matter what. And for as long as people want to not disclose, or as much as people want to disclose, I think that that should be an individual choice. And I think that that needs to be a part of this conversation so that we can overcome the victim blaming aspect of this narrative. I'm trying to change the narrative around the panic defense from like the panic of the murderer to the panic of the trans person. You know what I mean? Like the panic is being named as the wrong person. Like the fear that LGBT people face, like walking through the world, you know, forming relationships, that is the feeling that deserves to be prioritized. And certainly the feeling that I'm trying to prioritize with doing this work.
Many of these cases seem to go beyond a simple murder. According to Dr. Andresen, these murders are often very violent, where a victim could be stabbed dozens of times or even dismembered. In one particular case that took place in Denton, Texas, the murderer stabbed the victim 41 times in self-defense after the victim supposedly attacked him. According to Carsten, the defense concocted a theory that the victim was almost like a horror movie villain and would not stop coming after the murderer, even after being stabbed over and over. The jury sided with the murderer and acquitted him.
Now, most people would have said, like, if this had been a woman that had hit on him, you know, and he had stabbed her 41 times, and he had tried to say, well, this woman came at me and she was like a superwoman, and I had to stab her 41 times, probably the jury would have taken a moment and said no. But the fact that it was a gay male, they sort of were willing to acquiesce to that theory. That killer, after he was acquitted, he went to the court a month later and said, I want my knife back. So he stabbed somebody to death 41 times, says, I want my knife back. They gave it to him. So he got his knife back. He was interviewed by journalists, and he was 21, 22. So he bragged. He said, I got my knife back. He said, killing a person is just like killing an animal. Once you do it, you get used to it. And he said, it wasn't even self-defense. I was just mad. But also, I just think with, in terms of masculinity, you know, it's considered almost, I'm using this term wrong, but almost like an honor crime. Your masculinity has been threatened. And so as part of that, you not only extinguish the threat, but you also teach that person a lesson, or you make a point about what happens when you transgress.
One potential explanation for the gruesome nature of these murders is thought to be almost an attack on one's own psyche, and more specifically, an attack on what the gay or trans person represents to the murderer's psyche.
The times that we see the panic defense being used because the homophobic or transphobic gay person, or like the person who is afraid of their own attraction and feelings, is acting out the violence at their own feelings, you know, like they are attacking their fear, their own fear, as it's projected onto a gay or trans person. Like the panic defense is obviously like the most extreme ends of homophobic and transphobic violence, like brutal stabbings and beating up people. But I think that we see that happen like on a smaller scale, like a lot. Just like there's like a trope of like the homophobic bully is like secretly gay. And the reason that the reason that that trope exists is because like, yeah, that person is acting out the violence against their own feelings. And that's why it's so emotional, and why these cases are so brutal often, is because they're lashing out against their own emotional state, and they're trying to prove something to themselves, either like their own heterosexuality or like their own stability in themselves. And I pity them for that, but not enough for this to be okay.
According to Jamie, defenses like the gay and trans panic and a history of bias against the LGBT community has led them to feel as if the government doesn't care if they live or die.
The way that our government handled the AIDS epidemic and talked about the AIDS epidemic really made clear that like they did not, and certainly we're seeing a similar mismanagement of public health happening right now, but when there was an explicit homophobic lens to that, like, it was like, no, we don't care whether, gay people are safe. Certainly, like, people in my community don't feel like the police are their allies, don't feel like the government is their ally or somebody that they can appeal to for fairness. And the reason why is because of things like this, and because of the ways that stance has been previously made known and laid bare of not expressing, care towards my community, because there's always been like huge problems in gay and trans community that has led to like higher morbidities for trans women, like lower life expectancies, and that's not a priority to the government or to the police or to any like authoritative body. It's only a priority to us in our community, and we really do the work of keeping each other safe.
Part of the work Jamie is doing has led her to testify in front of the Maryland General Assembly in support of a bill that would prohibit panic defenses in her home state of Maryland. The bill is being co-sponsored by Delegate Julie Palakovich Carr. I spoke with the delegate to find out what the bill would actually do and why she proposed it.
So I'm sponsoring legislation with Senator Clarence Lamb that would prohibit the use of that particular defense, the use of the panic defense. And it does two things. For murder cases, it says that you can't use the panic defense basically as a mitigation to try to plead down or to have the court go from a murder charge to a manslaughter charge. And then the bill also just says you can't use the panic defense as a defense in assault cases. So I actually had a constituent who brought me this bill idea about 1.5 years ago, and it was a very personal issue for him. And once he flagged it for me and I saw the action that the other states were taking, I felt pretty strongly that Maryland needed similar protections for its residents as well. And I'll note that last year, actually, the legislation as passed by the House actually expanded. It wasn't just protections for prohibitions against the use of the panic defense when the victim is, an LGBTQ person, but also the committee amended the bill to prohibit use of the panic defense so that you can't consider a person's color, national origin, or race as well. This legislation really is about sending a strong message that the state, values everyone and wants to make sure that all Marylanders are safe and get their day in court in a fair manner. And hopefully we're going to be the, I believe, 12th state to join that growing list of states that have already passed this protection.
After the recent passage of a bill banning the panic defense in Virginia, there are now 12 states plus D.C. that prohibit this legal strategy. I asked Carsten how well these bills work.
First of all, it sends a loud and clear message that's unacceptable. So I think on that level, that's good. You want people to know, like, you know what, we're not going to tolerate violence against you anymore. No matter what our feelings are, I would love to see that from a conservative lawmaker, for them to say, I have different opinions about this, but you know what? One thing we can agree on is nobody deserves to be killed and nobody deserves to be able to use this defense. And I think that communicates that your life is worthwhile and that you matter. But, people are always going to try to go around laws. A lot of the gay panic, or the laws that prohibit gay panic defenses, it prohibits people using it as an excuse. Somebody hit on me, it made me lose my mind, I killed somebody. You can't do that anymore under a lot of those laws, but they don't cover self-defense. So you could see a bunch of people saying, well, I have gay friends, but somebody tried to sexually assault. So I'm not a bigot, but somebody tried to sexually assault me. I have a right to defend myself. And so they use self-defense. And there was a case in California, which I believe was the first or the second state that had the gay panic defense laws. And in California, it was a case where somebody strangled somebody else. They worked together, they went out, they got drunk. He ends up strangling the other person and that person dies. And his attorney said, well, he was defending himself from an attempted sexual assault. And so they entered into a plea deal, and I think he got 12 years in prison. And the family agreed to the plea deal. I'm sure that the defense attorney was said something to the effect of, like, we're going to make your husband and your father, we're going to destroy him in court unless you agree to this plea deal and you let my client go away for 12 years. So even if you have laws, people are going to try to get around those laws. The case in Wyoming, Matthew Shepard, one of his killers, the judge said, you're not allowed to use a gay panic defense. The killer's attorney still brought two people to the witness stand who said, and I don't know if it was erroneous or not, but they basically just said that Matthew Shepard had flirted with them. And so they wanted to create this idea that he was some sort of, he was a very petite man. I mean, he's about 5'4". He was not violent at all, but they wanted this idea that he was some sort of aggressive sexual predator. So even after the judge said, you're not allowed to do this, they still went around and did it. I think as we become more savvy about sort of the way that these defenses are used, the law combined with a prosecutor that knows how to talk about how people try to use these biases against the jury, then that's going to be a much better combination than just saying, like, we're just gonna let defense attorneys say whatever they want to say.
Assuming that defense attorneys will attempt to go around the law, I asked Carsten what else would need to happen to make the panic defense less effective.
I think everybody needs to grow up a little bit. So one of the things that you'll see in court, I think defense attorneys, whether there's law or not, they're going to try to use these theories. One of the worst things I think that can happen are for prosecutors who are not used to talking about matters of sexuality, matters of adults interacting with one another. They get this issue and they don't know what to do. They freeze. They're like me when I try to have a talk about like sex education with my kids. You think you're going to be like super cool and it's awkward. So for the middle case we had in Travis County, it looks like the victim, and I don't know what this means, but the victim was probably not gay. I don't know anything about the person who killed the victim, but the victim was probably not gay. I think the prosecutor was so stunned by the defense theory that this person's gay and tried to sexually assault the defendant. I think they were so befuddled. And I also think they were balancing. Could you imagine if your son is killed and somebody said, oh, your son was killed and your son's gay and he tried to rape somebody? You're floored. Your heart is broken. You're devastated by the death of your son. And then you're like, wait, my son's not gay. My son's not a rapist. And then just sort of trying to sort all of that out. I think the prosecutor in that case was probably trying to balance all of these different things. Because I imagine, the victim's family is probably like, they probably just stick on it. What do you mean they're gay? What do you mean they're gay? Not that there's anything wrong with it, but what do you mean they're gay? One of the things these defenses do is they confuse everything. They muddy the water and they make everything seem uncertain. So I think a prosecutor in this case would say, they have made an allegation that this person made a sexual advance. They've also made an allegation that this person's gay. I don't know, and they should say something like this: I don't know what gay means. We have no record of this person sort of, having a partner or dating men or, but maybe he did, maybe he didn't. It doesn't matter. The facts of the case are going to show this was not an attempted sexual assault. This did not happen, and know how to address the bias. The prosecutor should say, the defense attorney wants to confuse you. They want to create reasonable doubt. So one thing they've done is they've suddenly focused all of this tension on whether the victim is gay or whether the victim isn't gay. That's going to create this sort of reasonable doubt. That's going to create all of this confusion. It's going to muddy everything up. What the issue is that an unarmed man was stabbed 4 times to death and brutally murdered in his own apartment. That's the issue, but not to turn this into like junior high from the 1980s. He's not gay. He's 100% heterosexual, and getting all fixated on who's gay, who's not gay, what does it mean to be gay? So I just think hitting it head on and not treating it like some sort of, not letting it scandalize anybody, not letting this confusion reign.
Some of the biggest criticisms of bills prohibiting the panic defense come from defense attorneys who argue that these laws prevent due process to their clients as guaranteed by the Constitution. Other opponents of the bill believe it's just not a problem.
I would say anecdotally, we have seen some pushback. In fact, I was looking on Twitter about kind of what people were saying about the legislation, and there was one resident, just a person in Maryland, who posted about how they submitted testimony in support of the bill. And there were some people who were kind of trolling her and, saying some pretty ugly things about why this legislation wasn't needed and actually like justifying the use of the panic defense.
I asked Jamie what she would say to opponents of this bill who believe that there are cases where these defenses are justified.
Honestly, to conserve my own energy, I don't have anything to say to them. I know who I am and that my community deserves the right to live and exist comfortably. And I'm not there for the purpose of argumentation. I'm there for the purpose of, I don't want to say representation, but that's a part of it. Like, I'm bringing the names of Mia Henderson and Gabriel Barnes to the legislature because I'm still seeking justice for them. I'm still seeking justice for my community. And this is a step that needs to happen in order for that process to be easier for me and for my community in the future. So that's where my priority is. My priority is not on changing people's minds about this. Certainly not. Because the process of like, I'm not like just arguing that you deserve to live is like, even just arguing what I am now is so emotionally exhausting, and any opponents can buzz off. That'll be my polite way to put it.
The reality for most trans people is that they will live in a world where they are more likely to be murdered, have higher rates of mental illness and suicide attempts, less likely to have employment with a higher rate of poverty, and have a lower life expectancy than the general public. Realizing this, I asked Jamie if this bill is enough to bring justice and equality to the trans community.
This bill is definitely not enough to effect change on those statistics. This bill is not even enough to curb violence and the epidemic of violence against Black transgender women. This bill is like the very bare minimum that I would need to feel comfortable seeking justice for Black trans women who've already been the subject or target of violence. In order to make those real large changes, our attitudes like as a society and culture need to change about like trans people and their behaviors and our culture. I think that girls need higher access to employment and better safety and housing. But really the people who are doing the most critical work advancing that are grassroots trans leaders. The solutions are going to be community-led, and we should be really turning to trans people, giving them as many resources as possible in order to solve these problems in our community. If people are just now hearing about this bill, I would encourage them to familiarize themselves with the epidemic of violence happening against Black transgender women. And then the action steps that I would take would be to engage with trans-led, specifically, organizations working to make a change on this issue. Regionally, shouting out No Justice, No Pride, Casa Ruby, and Baltimore Safe Haven as organizations in the DMV area. I think that there's a lot of really amazing activists doing this work who always need financial support, but also the support of like people caring, like I think that this is a real epidemic of violence, and it's something that's felt really deeply in our community every time. And it's exhausting to be the only ones who are feeling that. Definitely the first step is realizing the extent of the problem and familiarizing yourself with the cases and with the work that's being done.
Through his research, Carsten has found 205 cases that use the panic defense, and he argues that this is one element of a whole campaign of bias against the LGBTQ community, and that running these strategies out of existence will hopefully have a diffusion of benefits that will make things better in other areas where there is bias against the community. He also calls for a national database that tracks these cases so the burden does not continue to fall onto the marginalized communities to do that research. After my initial interviews with Carsten, Jamie, and Julie, the state of Virginia became the 12th state to ban the panic defense, and the Maryland State Bill successfully passed the Maryland State House and was sent to the Senate. However, as of this recording, there are only 2 weeks left in the legislative session. The bill needs to be heard on the Senate floor, and soon. Jamie reached out to me to express those thoughts. She said, "We just need this bill to be heard for a vote. Our advocates believe that if it's heard for a vote, then it will pass, like it did unanimously in the House. If it gets stalled any longer, then it will die the same way as last year. People need to know that this bill is a priority." Any citizens of Maryland in favor of this bill can reach out to your local state senator and encourage them to get this bill on the floor and vote in favor of it. And if you're not from Maryland, but your state allows these defenses, reach out to your legislators or find grassroots activists who are doing the work to end these defenses. I'm Luke Fisher, and this is The Long Arc. Thank you for listening.